this is not a negotiation around a losing Ukraine, a Ukraine that has surrendered. Putin is stuck in this war. He can't really get out of it. His country's economy and broader society is currently completely enveloped in this war. And if he ends the war very, very suddenly, he will have a big vacuum in the economy. And therefore, he's going to keep looking for ways to get out of this and ways to perpetuate the war.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for Times Radio. I'm Louis Sykes. Today we're speaking to Ian Garner, professor at the Pilecki Institute in Warsaw and a recent re-addition to the Russian Federation's entry ban list. Ian, thank you very much for joining us. Before we get into the latest on the war in Ukraine, you've been added or re-added to the Kremlin's entry ban list for the Russian Federation. What can you tell us about that list and how you've become a target of the Kremlin?
Yeah, for sure. So, I mean, the Kremlin has been producing these lists of foreigners to ban who can't enter the territory of the Russian Federation should they want to, which right now I definitely don't. They've been doing it for several years, and this has gone hand in hand with domestic laws that paint Russians as foreign agents. And of course, they're not foreign agents, they're just critics of the regime. And thus, many other scholars, analysts, politicians, you name it, some quite odd names from time to time find ourselves announced on these lists from time to time. And I have managed to hit double by being banned as a Canadian back in 2022, and now again this week being banned as I believe the phrasing was somebody who collaborates with the destructive British media, which I think is what we're doing today on the Times Radio. So.
And you know this ban, the most recent one, only came in the last kind of 24 to 48 hours. Did you know that this was coming? Had you heard that they were going to be re-adding you to the list?
No, so there's no whispers, no signs until your name appears on the list, and the lists don't really seem to be designed with any particular logic. So, I guess it's some intern in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs Google some names of people who've written even somewhat critical or even honest things about what's happening in Russia and stick some names on a list. In terms of practical effects, my name's been on the Canadian list for almost 3 years, and I haven't really had any more targeting than anyone else who writes about Russia on social media or day to day in any way whatsoever. So, I mean, it's a badge of honor, but in practical terms, it doesn't really mean that much.
So you don't have any fears or worries personally, because of course you're based in Poland. You're a lot closer to the Russian Federation than we are here in England. But you're not worried about any further action from the Russians?
No, not at all. And I think if there's anything to be concerned about, the Polish security services take the threat of Russian aggression very, very seriously, and I'm sure they will let me know if there's anything to be concerned about.
And what does it mean for the other people who are on this list? I mean, there are some people here at the Times who have also been banned from Russia. Is there any other concern that people on that list might have?
I can understand why people who haven't heard of these lists before might be worried that they might be targeted in a more physical way, because we have seen Russia use physical aggression and criminality beyond its borders in various ways to target people who've criticized it. But I think all of us are small fish in a very big sea, and if Russia wants to target people, they would target the really big, the leading names, and in particular Russians who've gone abroad, rather than foreigners who are criticizing and commenting from the outside.
And it's interesting that you've effectively been added twice, once as a Canadian citizen before. What does that say about the way Russia put these lists together?
I, to me, it probably says that the left hand has no idea what the right hand is doing, that these lists are thrown together in quite a haphazard and arbitrary fashion. There's no reason why I should be banned twice. If I couldn't go to Russia last week, then now I doubly can't go to Russia. It makes no sense. And this has always been true of Russia. Back in the Soviet days, there was at least one leading scholar who held dual citizenship. I believe Australia and possibly British, possibly American, who was banned under one passport but used to travel under the other passport more or less openly. That was in the 1980s when things were at least easing up a little bit. However, I even before this week, I wouldn't have liked to risk it. I think anybody who attempts to go to Russia right now is asking for trouble, and of course is morally complicit with funding the war in Ukraine, because they're spending the money they use abroad will only go towards perpetuating the war.
Well, onto that war itself, the latest on Ukraine. We've seen in no small terms a rejection by Russia of a lot of those agreements discussed in Washington by European leaders on Monday and earlier this week. Is it just the boots on the ground you think that the Kremlin's objecting to here, or is there a wider effort to spoil any sort of ceasefire or peace talks deal?
Well, I mean, one does wonder at what point Putin will decide to end the war and say that the land deal is enough. And yet all the signs are that he continues to pursue this maximalist policy of wanting to really subjugate Ukraine in a much more thorough way. And I think from what we're hearing from the Kremlin, ultimately, whatever deal we end up with, whether it's troops on the ground, whether it's economic support from Europe, the Kremlin will have a problem if there are roadblocks in the way of Putin and his allies being able to take advantage of a rump Ukrainian state, which will be in a demographically, economically, and militarily very fragile situation in the wake of the war.
And how realistic is the support that the West is offering, especially this idea of US air support that Donald Trump himself was floating? Are the Russians ever going to agree to something like that?
I don't think they will agree to it, and so it is up to Western leaders to make them agree to this, right? This is not a negotiation around a losing Ukraine, a Ukraine that has surrendered. Putin is stuck in this war. He can't really get out of it. His country's economy and broader society is currently completely enveloped in this war. And if he ends the war very, very suddenly, he will have a big vacuum in the economy. And therefore, he's going to keep looking for ways to get out of this and ways to perpetuate the war. But right now, the West is not signaling any sense of really taking the idea that they would actually defend Ukraine in the case of further Russian attacks seriously. Because any security guarantee in any context, even outside of Russia, Ukraine, rests on both parties believing that the guarantee is real. And that if push comes to shove, somebody will press the button, send in the troops, launch the air defenses. And it's been very clear that the Russians just don't think that the West will do it. They didn't think that the West would really come to support Ukraine in February 2022. They were very surprised by the initial unity and the initial flood of support that came in the first 6 months to year of the war. But now they've been looking at the way that we've been fragmenting, falling into argumentation. The European leaders, even today, are arguing over the detail around what the coalition of the willing, as it's being labeled, might be willing to do. Donald Trump's promises seem to change from week to week. And so Putin just has to sit back and wait for everybody else to duke it out.
And, as you say, Trump is still clinging to this idea of further talks being possible. He wants a bilateral with Zelensky and Putin and then a trilateral with Zelensky, Putin and himself. So far, the only thing Putin has offered is for Zelensky to come to Moscow. I think pretty much everyone in Ukraine recognizes that as being quite disingenuous. Do you think the Americans recognize that as well? And what's the message there that Putin's trying to send?
Well, we've seen Trump getting a little bit irate on, he posted a message on Truth Social just yesterday. He seemed to be quite frustrated with Putin and the ongoing attacks and the stalling of the peace agreement. But certainly if you read the Russian media, which of course is all state media, and if you look at what Russian politicians have been saying over the last few days, it's that the bilateral summit, or trilateral, the meeting between Putin and Zelensky, will not be a negotiation. It will be to actually sign the deal. It will be Zelensky coming to eat his slice of humble pie very publicly, and they haven't quite put it like this, agree to surrendering Ukraine. And Zelensky is no fool. He may have been a comedian, but he's not a fool. He knows exactly what Putin is up to, and of course he knows that of course this offer to come to Moscow is just very obvious trolling, and he knows that Putin isn't really addressing his concerns. And what he wants is a genuine security guarantee that is going to be operationalized and that has a very clear plan of actions, that there will be red lines that are uncrossable. And he doesn't see that happening either. So both sides, I think, are very, very far from getting what they want, even though Trump is saying by the end of August, I want to organize this big meeting. I think maybe he'll get it. Maybe I'll be proven wrong. Trump sometimes gets things that he wants through seemingly sheer force of will. But I think there was just a little bit of a sense of naivety coming out of the American side.
And so, where does that leave that big meeting of European leaders that we saw on Monday? I mean, is there anything that Ukraine or will come away from that feeling they've achieved, or anything the Russians might be worried about out of that meeting?
I was actually surprised by how united the Europeans seemed. There was some criticism on social media and in the press about these photographs the European leaders had lined up before Donald Trump as if they were prostrating themselves before the American leader. But actually, to me, that picture communicated a handful of European leaders, the most important leaders in Europe, bar Poland, who was notably absent, who were all lining up and saying, this is what we want. We do want meaningful security guarantees. We are going to talk about the detail. It's going to be difficult to talk this through. It's going to be difficult to come to an agreement. But if you think it's going to happen just as a photo op in Hungary or Switzerland, which have been mooted as possible locations for a Trump, Putin, Zelensky meeting, that's not the way that it's going to be. We have to get serious. And so I think Putin will be, if not terrified by this, then he will be frustrated that some of the disagreements and fragmentations that we've seen over the last few months in public from European leaders didn't come to the fore, at least on Monday in DC.
And as part of that meeting, there are reports of Kiev drawing up plans to buy around $100 billion worth of defense equipment from the US. Is that something that could only happen after a peace deal, or do you think Kiev have a chance now after that pretty good looking, at least, meeting with Trump?
I think Trump's a transactional kind of a guy. He likes dealing in these simple deals. You pay me money, I give you something. That's the environment that he comes from, business, in terms of business. And I think if the Ukrainians are willing to fork out $100 billion, he'll probably sell them just about anything they want. I don't think he has any moral objection to selling arms to Ukraine. And we've seen him sort of go back and forth over the last couple of months about, is he supporting Ukraine a little bit more? Is he supporting Putin a little bit more? What he really wants always is power and money. And so I think it's a smart play from Ukraine. He gets to announce a big deal. They get some arms. Win-win.
And as you mentioned before, we did have that slightly odd from Trump Truth Social post blaming Biden for refusing to let Ukraine strike into Russia. This seems like closing the stable door after the horse has bolted, though, doesn't it?
Well, I mean, I don't think we can read too much literally into Trump's posts on social media, which are always stream of consciousness, shall we say. But what's notable about it is he's maybe signaling this sort of more emotional response to, and boy, I am reading crystal balls here, it's a guess, right? You know, he's signaling this more perhaps emotional response to frustration at what's happening. He's signaling that he maybe thinks that long-range strikes aren't off the table. And we did hear a rumor that he was mooting this possibility with Zelensky last month when he was at his most frustrated with Putin publicly, discussing what Zelensky might need to conduct some more long-range strikes in Russia.
But does any of the discussion we've seen this week really matter? Because a lot of it feels like it's been overshadowed by this unwillingness or inability of Trump to kind of bring pressure to bear on Russia. There's been absolutely no talk since Monday out of the White House about those sanctions that Trump was threatening on people buying, on nations buying Russian oil. Is that just completely out the window now? And what sort of message does that send to Moscow?
Well, I think you've got it in one, really. the European leaders aren't really putting together anything, and they probably have very little power to do anything to actually limit Russia or force Russia back down. The only person that can do that is Donald Trump. And Donald Trump seemingly, for now, is unwilling to follow through on some of the big threats that he's made. Maybe he thinks threats are enough. Maybe the threats were never serious in the first place. And I can tell you that the Russians just don't take Donald Trump very seriously. They didn't take him seriously when he did his big about turn last month and suddenly came out in support of Zelensky in Ukraine and started threatening Putin. Dmitry Medvedev, the former president who's still involved in the National Security Council, was pretty dismissive. The Russian media were dismissive. The Russian stock market didn't budge in response to that. And we're seeing the same thing today. The Russians are, if not quite laughing in Trump's face, then taking everything he says with a pinch of salt, because, as I mentioned, just as with the issue of security guarantees, these threats don't matter if the other party don't believe that you're going to follow through. And nobody believes that Donald Trump is going to follow through on imposing sanctions on Russia.
And meanwhile, as you say, the war continues in Ukraine. Putin's continued to strike on Kiev. But is that a poor move at this moment, though, given that the air campaign seems to be the one thing that actually does crack through to Trump on occasion?
Well, it remains to be seen exactly, predictably, what will break through and affect Donald Trump. But I think much more important is the fact that Russia is just continuing the war. They're applying pressure on the ground in the east of Ukraine. They're continuing this air campaign. They're continuing to strike at Kiev, both at military and energy targets and at civilian targets. This is a campaign of terror as much as it is a military campaign. And they are, by doing so, really showing that they're not very afraid of Donald Trump. Once again, they're not that bothered at the prospect of upsetting Trump. Maybe they believe that he won't be upset, but if there is any sign that he might be upset, they don't care. They're just going to keep going. We've seen them come out in the last few days and say that basically we refuse to accept any security guarantees that we don't have a say in, which of course is somewhat of a bizarre stance where the invading country would get to perhaps veto the security response of other countries, preventing a future invasion. And therefore, I think we don't really, when push comes to shove, find ourselves much further forward than we were in 2022 after the peace talks in Istanbul, which happened in spring 22, just after the outbreak of the war. The Russians presented a series of impossible demands to the Ukrainians, refused to really negotiate, and then walked away. And I think the one positive for people who want to see the fighting end is that Zelensky very clearly is willing to negotiate. And there are, I think, signs coming out of Ukraine that he and his team are willing to take what would be a very difficult and unpleasant pill for the Ukrainian people to swallow back home, and to try to ask Ukrainians to approve giving up land in the east of Ukraine. And a few months ago, that was just completely off the table. So Ukraine is looking for ways forward, and I think it is becoming politically feasible and imaginable that some sort of deal might be done. So the question really is, what will Putin do going forward?
Yes, and we talk about the plans that Ukraine is continuing to make in Kiev and military plans. Ukraine's continuing their own long-range strike campaign, just last night hitting the Inertia oil pumping station in Russia's Bryansk. Before this big meeting with Trump and Putin, there was some discussion about how that's starting to affect oil pump prices, petrol pump prices for everyday Russians. Is that sort of thing going to be concerning to the Kremlin?
It will only be concerning if it affects the practicalities of running the war and running the economy at a much bigger scale. But the concerns of ordinary Russians paying more money at the petrol pumps are probably pretty low on Putin's list of concerns. We've seen mass inflation, price rises, more limited access to certain kinds of consumer goods over the last few years, and Russians haven't really been perturbed by this. We've seen the rise of a class of people who've done quite well out of the war, the people who've gone away and fought and managed to make it back home in one piece with pretty vast amounts of money in their bank account. We've seen the middle classes who are doing well out of the defense and manufacturing industries. And so I just don't think on a practical level that's going to bother Putin until it starts to really affect the much bigger workings of the economy, and Ukraine would have to step up the scale of these attacks, which in the moment are more symbolic than effective, to a much greater scale than they have been so far.
And we also, ahead of the meetings earlier this week, saw this raid forwards, sort of a small offensive around Pokrovsk and in the Donbass by the Russians. The Ukrainians claim that's largely been halted and blunted now. But is that possibility for movement and ability to defend on both sides just going to encourage both Ukraine and Russia to continue fighting?
Well, absolutely. I mean, if you look back to the Minsk peace accords, which were agreed late 2014 and then again in 2015, and they were meant to end the fighting in the east of Ukraine after Russia had invaded those territories the first time around. Putin used this tactic when the negotiations were happening in the lead up to the date that the fighting was supposed to stop, to grab as much territory as he possibly could. I mean, he didn't get much. We're talking about hamlets and tiny villages. But this is a strategy that he will use again and that Ukraine will attempt to use again. And so it's easy to look at the battlefield calculus right now and say Russia has the upper hand, but we're also seeing Russia's recruitment numbers starting to fall again. Its economy continues to just about kind of stumble and stagger its way through month to month. Ukraine also has its own problems, specifically around manpower. And of course, arms deliveries from the West will still be vital to Ukraine. And so we will see both sides continue to push and jab and jibe back and forth until the fighting is done effectively and until a deal is signed. And so we're in this very, very fragile situation where peace is being much discussed, but very little is actually happening, either in terms of the high level peace talks, but also in terms of the battlefield action to stop the fighting.
So, to finish, Ian, has this week just boiled down to a sort of PR bump for Trump and a PR victory for Putin? Or are there signs now, as the dust settles from all of this negotiation, that there could be some sort of progress?
I think all signs are good. Let's try not to be too cynical here, in that Trump really would love to get a peace deal. Whether that's because he really wants peace or because he really wants a photo op is a discussion for another day, but he would love it, right? Zelensky is clearly changing position, and the position of the Ukrainians is shifting, and I mean the Ukrainian population is shifting around what might constitute an acceptable peace deal. That's good news. That is unequivocally good news, and it's not pleasant news because I'm sure many people would like to see Ukraine be able to recapture all of the territory it's lost and have everything they want, but sometimes that's not going to happen, right? So once again, as always, we come back to the problem that the Kremlin is occupied by a dictator who is in a very secure position at home, a dictator who doesn't need to end this war, for whom there are going to be downsides to ending the war, and who doesn't really need to grab territory as much as he does, or at least this is the position that he has constructed for himself. He wants to create the impression that he has conquered Ukraine in some symbolic fashion. And so there is very little incentive for him to stop fighting right now until the Europeans get serious about security guarantees and agree on exactly what they want and what they will do. And Donald Trump gets serious about sanctions and other threats that might include approving or supporting long-range strikes against Russia. But until we see those things, then I think Putin will keep leading everybody else on a pretty merry dance.
Well, Dr. Ian Garner, professor at the Paletsky Institute in Warsaw, specializing in Russian politics and propaganda. Thank you very much for joining me today on Frontline.
Thank you.
You've been watching or listening to Frontline for Times Radio with me, Louis Sykes. For more on the war in Ukraine, you can subscribe to our YouTube channel and sign up for a membership, or you can hear all the latest news and analysis on Times Radio or read it at thetimes.com. And remember, we are in both podcast and video form. You can find us on your favourite podcast platform. It's Times Radio's Frontline, or you can watch us on Times Radio's YouTube channel. Thanks very much. Goodbye.